So the Yellowstone, it bears a lot of the brunt from a recreational perspective. I don't mean to portray recreation in a negative connotation, but it has its effects.
You know, I wouldn't want to see anybody not have access to the river, but we are loving it to death. In the end, we hope to have some sort of a community-driven recreation plan developed. We are trying really hard to stay away from the mistakes that other valleys have made that have created deep chasms within the community.
I really believe the only way to implement things that are going to make it more resilient and healthy is from the grassroots, local, community-led effort. Even though that can be messy, we get frustrated, we ebb and flow in the amount of energy that we want to give towards that effort. At the end of the day, we know that our love and connection to this place is so strong, and that's our strength, I think, as a community.
Welcome to the Stories for Action podcast. This episode is part of the Life in the Land project, which is a series of films and podcasts produced by Stories for Action, which hears from folks that interact with the complexities of Montana's landscapes, speaking to the value of locally led work and the holistic approaches needed for healthy communities and the ecosystems that they're a part of. I'm your host, Laura Tomov. This is part 2 of 2 podcast episodes that accompany the Life in the Land film on the Upper Yellowstone River. The film, which came out last November, and these 2 podcast episodes look at how no matter what the pressure on the river, that greater resilience can be achieved when the response is guided by the local community and by the river itself. It touches on elements of connection, socially and environmentally, those connections that have been lost and where there are areas to repair. And it shows that in order to talk about the health of a river, the health and well-being of the people connected to that river is a big part of that conversation. You can find the 52-minute film at lifeintheland.org, where it's available for free personal viewership and meant to be used in gatherings for communities, organizations, classrooms, anyone, to kick off deeper dialogue around these topics. So please reach out to us through the website if you wish to host a free screening at your gathering, or if you'd like to learn more about resources that can support your facilitated discussion after the film. Before you listen to this episode, if you haven't already, we highly encourage you to listen to our most recent episode, which is part 1 of this piece. There is key context about the people and place of the Paradise Valley and this stretch of the Yellowstone River, including discussion around the floods of 2022. Today's episode will focus on the response to impacts from increased river recreation here, something that much of the West is currently grappling with. We'll look at what a community-guided response can look like to these pressures, and we'll also look at topics of adaptation, changes in land use and community dynamics, the impact of social disconnections in rural communities, and the realistic challenges, but rewarding value of collaborative approaches. With all of the elements we mention in this podcast and in the film, we hope it not only creates connection and engagement around the health of the Yellowstone River, but creates sparks for everyone, no matter where in the world you call home, to connect and engage with your own local river. All of these interviews in this episode were conducted in the fall of 2022, just a few months after the historic flood that June on the Yellowstone River. The Yellowstone River has its headwaters in the mountains of northwest Wyoming and immediately passes through Yellowstone National Park. As it leaves the park and enters southwest Montana, it passes through a valley that today is commonly known as Paradise Valley. This region has its complexities both ecologically and socially. This valley has been homelands to various indigenous tribes for at least 13,000 years. French fur trappers and miners came in the 1700s, then European American settlers and cattle ranchers. And in 1872, with the designation of Yellowstone National Park, it was an early U.S. tourist and recreation destination. Today, Paradise Valley's economy is still led by tourism and outdoor recreation, largely fly fishing, and folks coming to pair time on this stretch of the river with a visit to Yellowstone National Park, that's immediately to the south of this valley. Small family-owned cattle ranches are also a local economic driver. As we mentioned, if you haven't already, do listen to our previous episode, which is part 1, for more detailed context of this region. The Yellowstone River, which flows for 700 miles, is the largest undammed river in the lower 48 states. Dams and other modifications to the natural flow of a river impact the biodiversity within a river, so the lack of a dam on the Yellowstone makes the ecological potential of this river relatively great. The upper reaches of this river, including Paradise Valley, are also part of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, which holds the highest density of biodiversity in the lower 48 states. The Yellowstone cutthroat trout has a healthy presence in this river, which is of importance, as this subspecies of native cutthroat has many pressures, including interbreeding and predation from non-native trout, habitat loss, disease, and impacts from drought. The ecological value and condition of this landscape, plus the dramatic landscape of mountain ranges and relatively large swaths of undeveloped land, make this river a focal point for locals, Montana residents, and visitors from around the world to connect to nature, largely through outdoor recreation. It is apparent with our world today that there are growing forces disconnecting us from the natural world, which we very much are and have always been a part of. And perhaps this disconnect from our environment correlates to our society disregarding the impact of our actions on our environment as we make decisions to meet our own human needs. So in that light, outdoor recreation, when carried out with a respectful approach, can be a means for people to reestablish that connection, for their own internal healing and benefits, as well as contributing to the collective benefits of having a society that understands the interconnections of our environment, the impacts to the sources of our water, our food, the impacts of climate change, the experience of being humbled to nature. Livingston is a mid-sized town that sits just north of Paradise Valley. Since this town's establishment in the late 1800s, it has been an intersection of many things: a railroad hub, a town center for local cattle ranchers, and the jumping-off point to connect people from a main east-west travel corridor in Montana, south through Paradise Valley, and to Yellowstone National Park. Today, Livingston still has those intersections, though it's safe to say that the outdoor recreation has become the main draw. Dale Sexton was born and raised in Livingston, and from early childhood was deeply connected to this river. Not only as a place to connect, but his family largely relied on trout from this river for sustenance. Today, Dale is the co-owner of Dan Bailey's Outdoor Company, an outdoor recreation retail and guide shop that has been a staple of this region for almost 100 years. Here, Dale speaks about the layers of connection that fishing on this river can create, beyond the physical fishing itself, and the role that fishing guides can play in relaying messages to the captive audience that they have with them on their boat that day, who may be a Montana resident or be from a number of places around the world.
We do more here than just tell people where to go. We try to create an experience that's meaningful and that sometimes is transformational. To spend a day on the Yellowstone River and to have the thrill of, wow, that lightning is getting really close, or there's a bald eagle that just flew within 30 feet of us and now he's perched right up there. As stewards to the resource, it's incumbent upon us to be able to basically educate our clients. We have a lot of times a pretty captive audience, to be able to share with them our sense of appreciation and respect that we have for the resource, and to where perhaps they could take that home and understand how important it is here, but also this whole world is one large organism, right? And it's not just about the Yellowstone, it's about the planet Earth. It's important that we have these values across the globe, essentially.
A recent study showed that the average time that kids in the U.S. spend outside is a mere 4 to 7 minutes per day. And that wasn't even necessarily in a space that allowed them to see the interconnections of a truly wild nature. It may have just been outside within a city. This reality is happening to our society's future decision makers, our future city planners, inventors, voters, and of course, adults today likely also mirror that path of disconnect. How is that disconnect impacting physical and mental health, brain development? How does that disconnect impact the decision-making around our water supplies, our food production, our city growth plans? I hope that we can all see that doubling down on efforts to reconnect our societies to our natural world is essential for many reasons. And of course, recreation itself has layers of other complexities. There's the concept of access. Of course, public lands are boasted to be the great equalizer, access for all. But the reality is there are many blind spots to that. For some, it requires a family that can take vacation time or purchase plane tickets to get to these public lands. And even for those who do live in a place like Montana, where it's geographically more accessible, if you or your parent are working multiple jobs and don't have a window of time to get out, or the gas money to get to the trailhead, no matter how seemingly close, or if you're inhibited by your physical ability, or can't afford the gear that's needed for that activity, which can sometimes be pricey. Things that many may take for granted. I bring this up just as a reminder that when we have conversations about recreation, that there are complexities to keep in mind. And putting it out there because maybe there are opportunities, big or small, that some of us have to ensure that those benefits from reconnecting through recreation are not just possible for those with financial means. Now we hear from Scott Fraser, a traditional ecological knowledge educator and founder of Project Indigenous, which works to reconnect people to their environments and provides environmental education for all ages. Scott is Santee and an enrolled member of the Crow tribe. He has worked around the world, but a large amount of his personal and professional time has been spent connected to the Yellowstone River, largely in the headwaters of this river in Yellowstone National Park and Yellowstone Lake. He speaks here about another immeasurable benefit that time in natural spaces can create.
So many times now as I go into the park and I look, and there will be a place where my dad and I were. And I realize that memories are sacred. And that's one of the things that Yellowstone Park does, is it creates a memory. Those memories, either happy or sad, they're still sacred.
And here he specifies on the reality of what those moments of connection can be for some.
When I go to Yellowstone, a lot of those people that I speak to have never been out in the country. I took a group on a hike in May. It was the first time a girl had ever been on a hike. And she had an experience.
When we were speaking with Scott, he expanded on this concept of access. He grew up largely in Billings, and he told us that he often thinks about the folks that he used to see there and elsewhere, that he knew didn't have means to get to places like Yellowstone Park or the upper reaches of the Yellowstone River, to witness a landscape without the presence of industrial development. He specifies that he thinks of the children who don't have parents who are able to get them to these places, and he says those are the people that he wants to make sure have a voice or representation in places like Yellowstone. Tourism and recreation is a leading economy for the entire state of Montana. And this is definitely true in the area of Paradise Valley and Livingston. Here again is Dale Sexton, co-owner of Dan Bailey's Outdoor Company.
Recreation and tourism are essential to the livelihood of Livingston, Montana, and Montana in general.
In the whole of Park County, which Paradise Valley is a part of, recreation spending totals about $500 million per year, and visitor spending creates about 3,300 jobs. Some agricultural producers in Paradise Valley even supplement their income by offering recreational services. In the last few decades, river recreation numbers have been increasing exponentially on the Yellowstone River, with a rapid spike in the last 5 years specifically.
The Yellowstone River is kind of ground zero for recreation. On a hot day, where does anybody and everybody want to be? So the Yellowstone, it bears a lot of the brunt from a recreational perspective. I don't mean to portray recreation in a negative connotation, but it has its effects.
Of course, people have been interacting with this landscape for thousands of years. And as we mentioned, this region has been a destination for recreation as a commodity since the late 1800s. So of course, this has been steadily increasing over time, but with an especially rapid increase in the last couple of decades. Then, when COVID hit and people were getting away from populated cities in droves and heading for, quote, open spaces, this made outdoor recreation everywhere, including Paradise Valley, skyrocket in numbers. This trend was not only seen in recreation, but with new residents moving in, as remote working became more accessible. The neighboring city of Bozeman, as well as Livingston and Paradise Valley, have been a hot spot for these trends, and growing pains have resulted, such as housing prices that are now unattainable for local working class folks, the added impact on infrastructure, and the environmental impact of high recreation numbers. Also a note here, myself as someone who grew up in Montana, know that the dialogue around out-of-staters can have negative connotations, whether it's folks moving here or those just visiting. So I do want to make it clear that we're not trying to paint that generalization, and that I think an honest conversation about impact does not mean we are villainizing every person with an out-of-state license plate. I encourage us all to bring more nuance to this conversation. Myself am someone who has been a transplant in other places, and when I moved back home to Montana, I was one of those new residents again. And unless if you're a member of a native nation that's indigenous to this land, we did all come from somewhere. The gatekeeping can get nauseating, and I've seen disrespect of the land happen at the hands of both longtime Montanan residents and from visitors. But yes, I see the reasoning for that rising hostility. The rush of new residents coming here from higher income cities around the country have contributed to our housing costs in Montana being so high that local working residents are going homeless or forced to leave completely. And it does make my skin crawl a bit to see the half-mile long line of trailers backing their boats up at every river access. But I know the positive impacts of recreation are real when approaches are done respectfully. So all this to say, it's a tricky topic, and tricky topics require honest conversations. So I hope we can speak honestly about the challenges and the impacts without villainizing or overly generalizing, or gatekeeping of who was there first or who deserves to experience a connection to nature more than somebody else. I myself have seen this increase in river recreation in many areas of Montana. But I do admit I was floored when I was at river access points on the Upper Yellowstone River on weekends in the summer of 2022 when we were there to gather footage for this film. A density of traffic, both on the river and at access roads, I hadn't seen anywhere else. Tom Coleman is a Livingston resident and longtime fly fisherman. Here he's speaking to the reality of the increase of recreation numbers on the Upper Yellowstone.
When I first got here, I was a guide. If we saw another boat up or downstream of us during the day, we would get anxious, and the other boat would be anxious too, and so we'd give each other some space, and it was rare that you did that. That's how little pressure there was on this river. And now I avoid it on weekends. It's beyond what I could have ever imagined.
And here again is Scott Frazier, sharing his perspective on this.
I have to step on myself for judgment, because that's one of the worst things that can happen, is that I judge people because they've They put, 25 rafts down the Yellowstone, Yankee Jim Canyon every day during the summer. There'll be raft after raft after raft after raft. And it's like, what do you think the fish are thinking? What is that doing to their environment? They always told me, the fish, they don't really have any feelings. So if you catch one and you have a hook in it, you just rip that out because they don't feel it. And I never bought that. People need to think beyond just what they're going to experience as a sport.
Here is Dale Sexton again, searching for avenues to address this reality of high recreation numbers.
I think that in general, recreationists want to not have a negative impact on the resource. I think it really comes down to education and making sure that people have a greater awareness of the riparian zones and how their being there can impact those zones negatively.
A note here, a riparian zone is defined as the land and vegetation area that occurs along a river or other body of water.
And I'm not talking about just the vegetation and such, but I'm also talking about wildlife and birds, and just being there, you can displace wildlife.
To me, it seems clear that there's a want to normalize having these honest conversations about the impact of recreation without necessarily villainizing it. When I hear the concerns coming from someone whose livelihood completely depends on the recreation economy.
It almost feels like recreation has become industrialized, and I'm particularly aware of it because obviously we're in the business of promoting use on the river. And I think we can all do a better job of advocating for the river and making people aware of their presence out there has an impact just being there. For instance, because of the flood this year, Mallard's Rest is closed, and now all of a sudden the access that's just immediately upstream from there, Loch Laven, has bared the brunt of all the traffic. And literally there have been hundreds of recreationists taking out and putting in there at the beginning and at the end of the day. It's clear, all you have to do is just drive into that access and you can see, oh wow, all right, well, this access was meant to accommodate 30 vehicles, and now all of a sudden it's accommodating 100. Well, those people need a place to park. So all of a sudden you have an area that was previously had grass on it is now a de facto parking area. And just as a result of more people, you've got more trash, you've got more dust. I know that the homeowners along Loch Laven have been at their wits' end, essentially dealing with the sheer amount of traffic that's been going down that access. Nobody's fault, but it's a new reality, and we need to come to terms with it because it's affecting the resource and it's also affecting the experience. But more importantly, it's affecting the resource, and it's not in a positive manner. There's things that we can do better, like, for instance, making sure that 90% of the traffic isn't on the most scenic section of the river. How can we come up with creative solutions to spread out the traffic and make people more aware of how to manage their waste, right? Make sure you're a good steward, and honor and respect.
As we mentioned in part 1 in the last episode, in 2016, there was a whitefish kill on the Yellowstone River, where tens of thousands of mountain whitefish died from PKD, or proliferative kidney disease, which is caused by a parasite whose impact can be exacerbated by increased water temperatures, which the Yellowstone River experienced in the month leading up to the fish kill. Due to the fish kill, Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks closed 183 miles of the Yellowstone River to all recreational activities for several weeks that summer. This temporary closure resulted in a total estimated economic loss of $500,000 for local businesses from Gardner downstream to Laurel, Montana, all of which were directly or indirectly tied to river recreation. Dale references the PKD fish kill in his next statement.
You can't just take recreation off the river and have all the problems just go away. It's not that simple. That said, when PKD happened and they closed the entire river to recreational use, It was really refreshing to drive down Paradise Valley and not see any traffic on the river. It was like, oh my gosh, he's becoming whole again.
Now we hear from Druska Kinke, a cattle rancher whose home and family operation is partially located along the Yellowstone River in Emigrant, in the center of Paradise Valley. She shares her perspective of the increased river recreation that she witnesses from her pastures.
The river traffic is nonstop. I mean, back in the day, my husband and his dad were actually guides on the river. You know, I wouldn't want to see anybody not have access to the river, but we are loving it to death. Sometimes I think we need a stoplight because it is nonstop boats. So that's increased traffic on Highway 89, which is a bad road at best.
Druska brings up another ripple effect of this river recreation increase, which is the increased traffic on Highway 89, the main artery to transport people up and down this valley, from Livingston to Yellowstone Park, and to all the fishing access sites in between. This two-lane highway often has a minimal shoulder. It has frequent wildlife crossings, and folks often speeding to get to their destination. The safety factor and impact on infrastructure are other ripple effects to take into account. Everyone we spoke with understands the essential nature of recreation to this region, and still no one shied away from speaking honestly about the increased numbers being a concern. So it did make me wonder, okay, with all of these complex factors, what is the response? Tom Coleman again, Livingston resident and avid angler and river restoration engineer, shares his response to this question.
With the pressure, I don't know what we can do. Bozeman continues to grow. We're starting to see declining fish numbers in a lot of areas. And I have to think it's related somewhat to that pressure, recreation and fishing. So I don't know what the answers are. We have challenges. But protecting the habitat, protecting it from further degradation in the tributaries and spawning areas, I think that's really important.
One of the main reasons that we were originally filming in this area is because we heard feedback from various folks around the state that they wanted to see a story that addressed the increase of outdoor recreation, specifically river recreation. Several places in Montana and across the West have been seeing it, and many are wondering if they're just witnessing the inevitable or if there is a responsive action to be taken. Our attention was brought to this region in Paradise Valley because the Park Conservation District, which is the umbrella for the Upper Yellowstone Watershed Group, is doing something about it. We introduced this watershed group in more detail in part 1, but it is a collaborative of folks, including local residents of ranchers, business owners, including fly fishing guides, and also agencies and NGOs that work in areas of conservation, agriculture, or community development. This collaborative holds regular meetings to discuss pressures and responses, develop plans and programs that benefit all elements of the watershed, from landscape to socioeconomic. In part 1, we discussed how the group was for a long time completely agricultural focused. The fish kill of 2016 led to an expansion of participation in this group, and it diversified in focus, as conservation and recreational business owners have since become just as active as the ranching representation. With a history of tensions between these groups, this diversification was not at first well received, and elements of collaboration are still difficult. But folks mention that the win is that people still come together for physical gatherings on a regular basis, and dialogue is had, which never used to be the case. And there are really exciting and creative programs and partnerships and friendships that have developed between all of these entities. Wendy Weaver is the executive director of Montana Freshwater Partners, which is an organization that works with entities around the state to restore and conserve rivers, wetlands, and other waterways. She is also a longtime Livingston resident. She's a lover of rivers and an engineer. She's also an advisory member of the Upper Yellowstone Watershed Group. She speaks here about the spike in river recreation in the past 5 or so years, especially with COVID, and how the Watershed Group was positioned to respond.
Luckily, we were coordinated and working together before that happened so that when we started to see these recreational pressures, we could come together and talk about what are we not doing, what do we need to do better to understand and manage those. We were very proactive and we met with Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. And what we were told is you need to have the data and you have to have the science to understand what those pressures are, what type of use, and where that use is happening before you would ever be able to talk about having some type of management plan.
In 2021, the Upper Yellowstone Watershed Group began conducting a recreational use study, where they gathered data and information on numbers, types, and timing of recreation on the Yellowstone River, from the community of Gardner to just upriver from Livingston, basically the length of Paradise Valley. They conducted counts in person and also utilized time-lapse cameras to more effectively gather data. These cameras were placed along the river on private property and solely used for gaining knowledge of the number of people, time of use, type of vessel, and type of recreation. 2023 was the third and final season of gathering data, and now the results will be presented back to the community for discussion and planning efforts. Of course, this will be a very complex process, but the data is necessary to serve as a base for folks to work off of. One finding from the study is the average increase in boat trailers at all access sites increased by 48% from the month of August in 2021 to the month of August in 2022. An added layer of complexity with these discussions will be the concept of recreational threshold, which can be very subjective, as our perspectives of what is seen as too many people on the river is extremely variable, depending on everyone's background. Wendy speaks to this element here.
So there is a very diverse experience between folks from out of state and people that have spent time and recreated in different ways without a lot of pressure on this river. And managing that conflict will be very challenging.
Druska Kinky, rancher and immigrant, is a longtime member of the Upper Yellowstone Watershed Group. She's the former chair and current chair of the Working Lands Committee that's within the group. She speaks here of how the group knows that navigating any plan will be tricky, to say the least. But they knew they wanted to do something proactive. They knew they needed data to inform that plan, and that they truly want it to be community guided.
In the end, we hope to have some sort of a community-driven, grassroots recreation plan developed. We are trying really hard to stay away from the mistakes that other valleys have made that have created deep chasms within the community of landowners and recreators, landowners and guides, and all of those things that can happen. We want to go about this really in a smart way. So our first step has been data collection, and we're hoping then at the end of the day it helps us direct what kind of recreational use the river needs, should have, and how to make it equitable for everyone.
Under Montana stream access law, the public has the right to access and move along rivers that run through private property up to a point of the riverbank called the, quote, ordinary high water mark. This imaginary line is typically distinguishable by a clear difference in sediment type. This law does not give the public permission to cross private property to reach the river, nor does it permit access to the floodplains adjacent to a river or stream. This access is granted to anyone, but it is often utilized by anglers who move along riverbanks or wade along in the river as they fish on foot. This law is not to be taken for granted, as in many states, this law doesn't exist, and the private landowners along rivers own the bank below the high water line and the river bottom itself. So, in states without this stream access law, if you're floating down in a canoe or raft or any vessel on a river and it cuts through private property, if you put your foot down, even if it's in the middle of the river, you could be prosecuted for trespassing. Tom Coleman speaks to the Montana stream access law here.
Well, I think across Montana it's special to have this stream access that we have, that we get to enjoy our rivers. There aren't a lot of other states that have that free access. We're very lucky. Could be under attack coming up too, the free access.
Significant changes to the riverbanks caused by the Yellowstone River's flooding in 2022 have made it difficult to discern the location of the ordinary high water mark, which is indeed the legal boundary, not the high water mark left by the flood. This confusion has led to trespassing by recreators onto private property. Here is Connor Parrish speaking to this. Connor is a project manager for Trout Unlimited and a resident of Livingston. We spoke with him also at the celebration for the river cleanup volunteers, so again, you'll hear the music in the background.
Trying to find a balance, and especially that education side, because I don't think people are doing things maliciously. I don't think they want to go out there and trespass. I think there's a lot of new people who are getting into this, which is really cool. It's exciting. Once again, that builds like more people who are interested in protecting our rivers, which is awesome. But we need to learn how to recreate responsibly, and we can access below the ordinary high water mark, but it's really a big challenge to make sure that people understand what that actually means. And now when you get like a 500-year flood event and everything seems like you can pretty much trespass in the whole valley, trying to figure out and explain to people that the ordinary high water mark is not where all the flood debris is, it is going to be a big education challenge, because today we saw a ton of people camped or having lunch or enjoying themselves up on private property, which I know is going to cause some conflict, and that's unfortunate because we don't want to put private land ownership at odds with the recreation community. I feel like we can support each other.
As the efforts of the Watershed Group's recreational use study has been community guided from the beginning, and early on had the support of both the ranchers and recreational business owners alike, Wendy Weaver says how the study itself and the proactive discussion to create a response to these pressures has actually been a point of trust building between different sectors in the Watershed Group.
We're helping bring attention to issues that the landowners are facing, like trespassing. They're seeing a lot of waste out there.
My producer Cassie and I stood with Druska Kinke on the banks of her property, only 3 months after the June floods of 2022. As we discussed in part 1, a considerable amount of their pastures that border the river went from lush green grass that supports their cattle to being covered with deep rocks, sandy silt, and root balls of massive cottonwood trees, all washed down from the force of the floods. Druska said that barely a month after the floods, while the Kinkes were only beginning to navigate the physical loss and severe financial impact of the flood for their family, there began a steady stream of boaters who would pull up on their property to have their picnics and rest stops, thinking that the Kinkes' washed-out pasture was fair game and below the ordinary high water mark, which it was not and may have only appeared this way because of the recent flood damage.
That whole high water, it was tricky anyway, and now it's like being disregarded. You're up at the house and you're doing yard work or whatever, and it's just sort of this continual screaming and playing, and they're there. I suppose you could go down and confront them, but we've never done that. They didn't know the river before, so they assume it's always looked like that, and no, it has not, and this is flood damage, and I guess my frustration comes in that if you looked around a little bit, you'd see, and you would recognize damage, and then you might have a little bit more respect for that. Part of it is just this public that isn't relating to a disaster. They're just happy to be on the river spending, a day that they aren't working in an office. And there's a disconnect between who's on the river and the landowner. And they aren't recognizing that it's an integral part of the river, being the landowner.
I asked Druska about the work that goes unseen to most of the public, that can be a daily reality for ranchers and people working on the landscape. How the relationship to the land is much different than that of someone recreating for the day. It's really more of a relationship of constant labor through daily observation of the health of the land and making constant adjustments to respond, and being at the mercy of nature's power. She speaks to that here.
My husband has been here all his life, born and raised right here. And his parents came in the 40s. And we are certainly not the oldest ranch in the valley by a long shot. But we've been here a long time. And maybe I just didn't understand adapting and changing conditions as much as I do now. Well, things started changing when they reintroduced the wolf. We had wildlife changes that impacted us. And then in 2001, the Fridley fire occurred. It started right across the river. Lightning hit a tree. We saw it happen. We watched out the kitchen window. And 4 days later, it had gone through 4 drainages, and it hit our mountain pasture on Trail Creek. It came over the top of that ridge, Chimney Rock Ridge, 300-foot flames, and we were trying to get cattle out. And I think that was my first experience with knowing that when disaster hits, nothing will ever be the same. And so we regrouped, and we fixed all of that damage. Then I think it was 6 years ago, the 6-mile drainage burned out. It's changed everything about how 6 Mile Creek flows through us now. It took out all of our infrastructure for irrigating. Now we have the flood. And so then you go down to more of a micro level where, on any given winter when you're calving, you might have the absolute worst conditions ever. And I think it might be 4 years now. We had a winter here that I think anybody who is trying to work outside with animals that winter has PTSD from those conditions. It was 45 below here and didn't get above 25 below for weeks. We could get calves out alive, and then they froze to death after we turned them out. And the toll it took on all of us, at some point you think you're just gonna, you just go in, I gotta make it through one more day. And you do. The emotional toll it takes and your capacity to manage that. The toll is greater and the capacity is less. So it gets really, really hard to keep adapting. But if you don't adapt, you don't survive. And at the end of the day, that's what you're trying to do, is survive.
Later in the day, Druska shared how that constant labor of a rancher's duties reflected onto their kids as they grew up.
I used to laugh when the kids were growing up because we never went on vacation. Our idea of vacation was going for a fun family Sunday up Trail Creek, which is where we have our cows in the mountains. And invariably, it would turn into work. So they don't really understand the concept of vacation. Ranchers are stewards of the land that they own or occupy. It is a tough job. There are a lot of factors that come into play because of circumstances within your own operation or in the world surrounding you. So we do the best job we can with what we have. And it is not perfect. There are many days I feel despair because the drought is very difficult. I see weeds. It's been overgrazed by wildlife for years, and our cattle don't help. And so that recovery won't happen. But at the end of the day, we're overwhelmed by the amount of work that maybe could help. So when I walk here at home, I try and think of the bluebirds and the sandhill cranes and the robins and all of those spring harbingers and rejoice in that. And when I come over here to the pond, I try and think about the fish that are in it, not by our choice, but because they wanted to come up the creek and be there. And I think about all of the raptors that we have, which are amazing. Those are the things I try and think about.
Earlier, Druska mentioned this disconnect between those recreating on the river and the ranches working on the land that they float by, and how those enjoying the open, undeveloped landscape are not always aware of the role the rancher plays in the land being maintained that way. Druska elaborates on this here.
The working lands in Paradise Valley are the habitat in Paradise Valley, which then puts most of the habitat on private land. The risks that will occur if the working lands do not stay vital in this valley are that there will be development. It won't be wildlife like what we know now. We will see nothing but more second, third home buyers. We're going to lose more of the connection that we've already lost. It's just vital that we keep working lands working in Paradise Valley, or we will all lose. And we all need to preserve the open space that we have.
For decades, it's been a trend of family-owned ranches having to sell out for a variety of reasons. But low profit margins and aging out generations are a couple of those factors. When the land is subdivided and fragmented, it not only has impacts on the health of the land, waters, and natural corridors that are required for wildlife to move across the landscape as they need. There are social impacts of these changes in land use. There's been a growing trend of people moving to this valley who do not occupy their home year-round. This is termed absentee landowners. If folks are not active members of their community, it's especially felt in rural areas, where each person contributes to things like volunteer fire department, keeping school attendance numbers high enough to keep the doors open, or just being a known neighbor who can help when there's a need. Here, Druska speaks to what she thinks can be another ripple effect of increased recreation.
It brings more people to the valley that see what it is and decide they want to be here. And I think the people that come here now don't have a connection to the land or the people that live here, because it can be a second or third home, and they aren't invested in the community, and they don't care about the issues for the community. And that is a pretty blanket statement. So there are exceptions to everything, and there are some people that come here that really try to be involved in the community and be a part. But in general, if people are doing second homes, buying up space, it does not help our community come together.
Druska speaks to some of the factors that contribute to community disconnection.
So I'm going on 40 years living in Paradise Valley, and when I first came here, really the valley was nothing but ranches. And none of them were great big. All of them were family owned. On any given day, for a lot of the ranching activities that take place, like branding in particular, you would trade help, and everybody would go to everybody's brandings, so that was our social time, and there were lots and lots of connections because of the families. And over time, those families have left for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it's death. Sometimes it's, I see the writing on the wall and there's too many people coming to Paradise Valley. Land prices are a little hard to turn down. And so that has changed what the valley looks like. We don't have the connections in the ranching community we used to have. We've learned how to sort of do everything ourselves and not rely on others, which is not a good thing, but is the reality. Livingston itself used to be a railroad town, and now it has changed. And it's changed because people have come to Livingston and Paradise Valley. And when you have people living in your town that don't work in your town, that changes the feel. But mostly, from my viewpoint in Paradise Valley, it's the connections. We've just lost so many of the rural connections that we had.
Druska elaborates on the impact of community disconnection, which can be applicable to rural and urban areas everywhere. When she references the watershed here, she's referencing the Upper Yellowstone watershed group.
When Rich's family was originally here, they ranched, but they had card parties on the weekends, and they did polka dances and, all of these things at the Immigrant Hall that brought people together, and people were more connected. And now it's like everybody's too busy, and we don't take time out of our workday to do the connecting work. You know, we have a small group that we actually said, you know, the first Sunday of every month, we're going to go have lunch together. And that's been great. But in reality, I may not see any of these other ranchers except for at a memorial service. And how sad is that? What I would like to see is that people reach out more. And it's vulnerable to do that. And so that's part of why I think we have still, you know, kind of separate groups in the watershed, is because it's vulnerable to be there and say what you feel or hear what somebody else feels. I would like for people to just try, to reach out to somebody, to listen better to somebody, and not immediately discount an opinion that you haven't heard, and find that compassion within yourself to care about what somebody's going through. Because in their world, it's big, even if it isn't in yours.
In part 1, we spoke to the dynamics of the Upper Yellowstone Watershed Group. But in a nutshell, there historically and through present day have sometimes been tensions between ranchers and river guides, when blame gets tossed around of who's negatively impacting the river, and tensions between ranchers and conservation groups or agencies over land and water management. As we had also mentioned, there are endless exceptions to this, and deep friendships and trusting relationships are leading to really neat projects happening between these sectors. But as members shared with us, the honest truth that after the fish kill, when the watershed group expanded from just being an agricultural group to including more conservation and recreation voices, it didn't mean that everyone was suddenly completely in harmony with one another. And it's worth celebrating what a big deal it is to continue to regularly get all of these voices into a room together to talk through pressures and collective responses. Of course, here I am just an outsider, but I can vouch for the fact that in the few times I was present at these gatherings, there was a lot of laughter and handshaking between varied folks, and the meeting itself was civil and functional. And the fact that the group has organized some pretty big feats that only a diverse collective voice could do. I know there are many complexities and sidebar chats within the group, but I also hope that the group members give themselves the credit they deserve and see the value in bringing folks together like that, and the importance of being honest about the challenges. Dreska speaks to the reality of that here.
I wish I could say that the Upper Yellowstone Watershed Group has solved all of our issues that actually divided us in the first place. We have not, but we talk about it. And that transparency has allowed for the dialogue to continue always. And so even when we hit those roadblocks or those issues that are really divisive, we get around them. We don't necessarily solve them, but we get around them and they don't destroy the watershed, which is what they did before. We continue to meet. There continue to be a lot of people come through the door. When you come to the watershed group, you see these people, you care about what's going on for them, they care about what's going on for you. I would have absolutely no reason to walk into the fly shop at Immigrant, because I don't fish. But through the watershed, I have the connection to the people that run the fly shop, and I care about them. And I think that is, in the end, enriching the watershed, bringing new ideas, making new connections.
As Dreska explains, the value in the group's existence goes well beyond the physical projects and programs. A large part of the value is in the personal, human connections created. Impossible to fully measure, but you may say it's the most important. Quite simply, without that, nothing moves forward. Plus, the intrinsic benefits created from connecting as fellow humans. The other value in this work and this approach is that it ensures things are truly guided by a local voice, not top-down. Nobody knows the challenges and nuances of a place like those who live there or are directly connected in some way. As locals know the interconnections of all elements, They also know how to guide projects that benefit the land, the community, the local economy, opportunities for youth, etc. So the work is naturally going to be holistic, which makes investing in these approaches the best bang for your buck. When the work is guided by locals and has local engagement, it lasts longer, rather than being dependent on an outside entity to lead, and then the work comes to a halt if that entity decides to move on to other things. There are endless ripple effects of approaches that are community-guided and collaborative in nature, which is why the Life and Land Project elevates these methods. Wendy Weaver speaks to this approach here, speaking honestly to the realistic challenges in grassroots and collaborative approaches.
I really believe the only way to come together and implement things that are going to make it more resilient and healthy is from the grassroots local community-led effort. Even though that can be messy, we get frustrated, we ebb and flow in the amount of energy we have that we want to give towards that effort. At the end of the day, we know that our loving connection to this place is so strong, and that's our strength, I think, as a watershed group and as a community.
Dale Sexton, co-owner of Dan Bailey's Outdoor Company, is not a member of the Watershed Group, but he's an active member of many other community and conservation efforts. He's a member of the Wild Livelihoods Business Coalition, which is a collective of local businesses in the greater Yellowstone area whose livelihoods depend on the health of the ecosystem. This coalition partners on efforts and create a collective voice to advocate for the health of wild places here. This coalition is a partner of the Watershed Group on the River Recreational Use Study. Dale has been a member of large-scale collaborative conservation efforts in the past and admits they don't fit for every issue in every place, and that it doesn't have to be an official collaborative entity to be impactful, that the concept of working together can be a daily practice.
With regard to collaboration, I think it's critical that we do come together as a community, that we recognize that we're recreationists or developers or we're agriculturalists, but at the end of the day that we're citizens of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem and, members and key components. I think it's time for us to really kind of lower our pride, if you will, with regard to working together and to meet others that we ordinarily maybe don't necessarily agree with, basically for everybody's good. I think if we can all acknowledge the importance of the Yellowstone to all of our lives, that those barriers become easier to climb over. Certainly collaboratives are not the be-all, end-all to everything, but I think in light of the challenges on the Yellowstone and all the myriad of issues that are facing it, I think it's very, very important that we all come together and be able to come up with a plan, a holistic approach, if you will. Not everybody's game to be involved in a process, but certainly you can pick up your trash when you're out on the river. Any number of ways that we can contribute that will benefit the ecology of the Yellowstone River. It's more than just showing up. It's basically your day-to-day life. Certainly showing up is important. It's incumbent that we go to these meetings and that we do confer on best practices and approaches, and it's also a lot more than that, and everybody can be involved.
On this topic of engagement and showing up, here's Dreska's response when we asked her about the value of getting involved at a local level on the decision-making of someone's place.
I think for many, it's really easy to complain and criticize. What I would ask of those people is to wait and at least try to reach out or have a voice. It's hard to have a voice. It's hard to commit the time to have a voice. But if you do not have a voice or a seat at the table, everything that happens will happen in spite of you. There are small ways that you can have a voice, and then there are bigger ways to have a voice, but you have to have one. You can't sit inside your four walls and be negative. because that doesn't help you and it doesn't help anybody else.
As Dreska mentions, it's theoretically easier to stay in the comfort of our like-minded bubbles and complain about the situation from afar. We may all be guilty of it at moments. I completely get it. But how do we shake that up and challenge ourselves? We may be surprised at what becomes easier, or dare I say, enjoyable. And of course, there are elements of access to engagement that those doing the planning can keep in mind, which includes timing and other accommodations for working families to be able to engage, and getting the word out in the right places to share about the engagement opportunities. Scott Fraser, Traditional Ecological Knowledge educator, shares his perspective on the current reality of how we've allowed our human dynamics to block good action from moving forward.
It seems like arguing is just something people will like to do right now. When you're arguing, you're not listening. That kind of attitude is not needed in this world what we're in right now. Total waste of time. People say, they end up arguing for their project, and I don't care about yours. But it's a free country, and we're sitting back and we're watching this beautiful river, speaking to us, and people aren't listening. I take that back. Some people are listening to them, and some people are doing things, and I have great hope, that will continue.
In the spring of 2023, the Fish, Wildlife, and Recreation Committee of the Upper Yellowstone Watershed Group held a gathering at a public space in Paradise Valley that was open to the public. The gathering was designed to be an informational session where different people and entities spoke about the various projects taking place in the valley and presenting opportunities for the public to get involved. Topics ranged from bear conflict mitigation to sharing about the river recreational use study. The chair of this committee is Jeff Reed, who runs Reed Fly Farm at his home property in Immigrant. And his work lies at the intersection of recreational tourism and agriculture. Jeff said he saw this gathering as an opportunity to show current watershed group members, other residents, and potential partners the showcase of efforts taking place in this valley, and to show how agriculture and recreation and the greater community were all working together in positive ways. He said he wanted the gathering to be an opportunity for the public to ask questions and voice their feedback, and be one of several gatherings designed for this purpose. Here is Jeff greeting attendees at the gathering, which had a generous turnout, filling a large banquet hall.
Your job here today is to speak your mind and give your opinion on these various projects. These projects we're talking about are things we do for fun here as locals, which is a different way to think about conservation than what we hear about in the media.
Just to give you some flavor of the gathering, one topic that came up was finding ways to ensure that the taxes that were generated within this county from recreational tourism, such as the bed tax or tax on hotel rooms, came back to fund efforts specifically in this valley, rather than only going to a collective state fund. Jeff speaks to this here and also provokes ideas here for the group on how to move this discussion forward in the future.
We all recognize we have a recreational use issue that we're talking about. It would be nice to see if some of these projects could get that money allocated back to you folks who are local managers here. I think it would be good to have our legislators in the room too for these particular questions.
Several speakers presented their projects to the group. And here's an excerpt from Jeff's closing statement, which shares an overall sentiment and a hope for the general community approach going forward.
These questions, even around grizzly bear expansion, right, are going to require local, thoughtful, intelligent dialogue between people who live here. Not the news, not the press, not any of that stuff, just the locals. So these issues we think are some of the important ones coming in the future. We appreciate your local involvement. And, Evan, you come across as an NGO, you're just a local business owner who runs a business, but you volunteer your time. And so these NGOs who are really helping carry the weight they definitely need local volunteers. And if you're just a local person and you want to help out with the brook trout project or whatever, please connect with these folks who help us out here.
After the gathering, we caught some words on camera from some attendees about the value that they saw in coming together in a collaborative planning approach. Here is Ashley Brubaker, a project manager for Trout Unlimited in the Upper Yellowstone and Shields watershed.
I've been going to the Upper Yellowstone watershed group meetings since I started in my position. Sitting down with people who use the land differently from the way I use it is hugely important. It's creating a broader understanding of how we all live on the land here.
And here is Bob Anderson, rancher and current chair of the watershed group.
The watershed group has come a long way because we were kind of separate as far as it was always ag-oriented, and then they put together some of the recreation-oriented folks, and now we're together, and those solutions are a lot easier to come by with both sides working on them.
Here is Max Hortzberg, advisory member of the Upper Yellowstone Watershed Group and conservation director of Park County Environmental Council, as he speaks to this connection of community and landscape health. These words were also recorded at the river cleanup celebration, so again, you'll hear the live music in the background.
The health and the well-being of the river and of our local resources directly reflect the health and well-being of our community. And if one's impacted, the other feels it directly, and vice versa. So it's going to take all of us working together to move forward in the right direction.
Scott Frazier shares an anecdote here that shows the need for collective perspectives when discussing something as complex as the health of a river.
Take different people and you take them to your favorite pond and you let them look. And then you walk away and ask them, what did you see? And some people will say, oh, it was beautiful, there was a water lily over here. Or somebody will say, oh, I saw a frog over here. And somebody will say, you know, I saw a fish over here. But you know, nobody sees all of it. That's the beauty of the water. That's the beauty of that river. We need everybody's input, leave out the drama, and then we can do something.
Scott shared with us his perspective on how the attitudes of respect and connection with the land does not need to be reserved for a certain demographic.
I used to go into some of these classrooms and I would tell people, you know, well, this is a native approach. And I felt bad about that because people are awakening to our land. They've been here many generations and they've eaten produce out of this land. You know, trying to bring everything together, I sort of think, well, by 4 or 5 generations of people being here, you know, they've eaten enough that they actually are probably becoming the land. You know, if we're going to gather an army to protect our planet, we better not be looking at color. We need to be inclusive. We all need to be participating in this. This is a planet of life, and it grows things, and it has water, it has all these combinations to have a wonderful experience.
And here he elaborates on this need to remember the urgency of taking action and of our interconnections beyond our immediate place, as the Montana area is the headwaters for much of this country's freshwater sources.
Water in this time is going to be less abundant for us to drink. And how we treat that water is an important issue in septic tanks and in runoff that we're getting through towns. The Yellowstone is drinkable water. It is fresh water. Yellowstone Lake is going to be a source that is going to supply people clear to the Gulf of Mexico with fresh water. And we need to be sure that they get that.
We hear some parting words from each of the folks we interviewed. First is Wendy Weaver of Montana Freshwater Partners, and she touches back on something that we dug deeper into in part 1, of approaches that allow the river to be less controlled or developed, and the value in taking guidance from the river itself, as well as local voices.
When we can understand that what we know may not be the best way and try to listen to other perspectives, or literally just look at wild systems and see what makes them wild and functioning and try and do what we can to get that equilibrium back into the system ultimately will be what creates the resiliency that we need to see.
Druska Kinke closes out here, touching back to the topics of recreation, engagement, and connecting deeper to a bigger picture.
So people have a real need, or drive even, to be outside. And that need needs to go a little bit farther than just enjoyment of your own thing. And it needs to go into, how come I can have this experience outside? And I can have that because there are stewards of the river, stewards of the land, stewards of the mountains, because others that have gone before us have cared about those things. And we must, in turn, care now.
Here is Dale Sexton with his closing message.
We're at a critical time for the Yellowstone. Unprecedented recreational use levels, demands for water escalating, climate change, too damn hot, lower flows all the time. Everything feels stressed. If there was ever a moment for us to really reground, it's right now. There's one Yellowstone River, and yeah, we're really fortunate.
And here is Scott Fraser with his closing message.
Look into the future, try to think 4 generations in front. Don't make water law for today or yesterday, make it for 100 years in the future. That's where water law in the Montana and the West was totally screwed up, whiskey's for drinking and water's for fighting. That's a terrible attitude. Water's for getting along. And there's not a thing on this planet that the water doesn't love. It is the total expression, and if it doesn't like it, it will change its state to include you. It's just wonderful. And we're really lucky to have it, but it's limited.
Thank you so much to everyone who spoke with us for this episode and for the Upper Yellowstone River film. Wendy Weaver, Dale Sexton, Druska Kinke, Scott Fraser, Whitney Tilt, Jeff Reed, Ashley Brubaker, Bob Anderson, Tom Coleman, Connor Parrish, Max Hortzberg, and Ashton Bunce. And thank you to all members of the Upper Yellowstone Watershed Group for allowing us to hang out with cameras, and to Watershed Coordinator Ashley Lowry. Thank you to Cassie Heron for co-producing this content in the field. We do hope that this 2-part podcast episode and the Upper Yellowstone River film sparks something for you and your relationship to community and rivers. Whether you're a resident of the Upper Yellowstone watershed, connected to the Yellowstone River in another way, or live anywhere else in the world. And maybe your nearest river looks and functions very differently. I'm sure you've noticed this constant theme in this content of connection and disconnection. In part 1 and 2, we've looked at that disconnect between people and their environments. In part 1, Druska speaks to the disconnect between government agency and those on the ground, those planning infrastructure or community growth, and the needs of the river. The disconnect between recreationists and those working on the landscape, and of course, the disconnect between community members themselves. It's easier said than done to repair these disconnections, but no matter how it happens, it needs to be a collective effort. So I encourage everyone to think on that and see what effort we can each show up with in the ways that we are able, personally and professionally. It doesn't have to be some grandiose project, and that's awesome if it is. But when it becomes intrinsic in our daily, simple actions, I think we may be pleasantly surprised of the collective good that we can create. You can find links to all of the things mentioned here today in this episode's show notes, including the site for the Upper Yellowstone Watershed Group, and look out for updates on the recreational use study, and you can also follow them on Facebook. In this episode's show notes, you'll also find a link to contribute to the Give Back to the Yellowstone campaign, which directly funds community-guided work, a lot of which we've been talking about here, that's benefiting the Yellowstone River and the people connected to it. You can find the film on the Upper Yellowstone River and other films in the Life in the Land series at lifeintheland.org. Reach out to us if you'd like to incorporate a film episode into an upcoming meeting, gathering, or in the classroom, and if you would like support in facilitating a discussion after the film. This second season of the Life in the Land project is generously supported by the Greater Montana Foundation, which benefits the people of Montana by encouraging communication with an emphasis on electronic media, on issues, trends, and values of importance to present and future generations of Montana. This season is also supported by the Crocus Foundation, Bioregions International, the Nature Conservancy, Montana Watershed Coordination Council, Montana Forest Collaboration Network, Foundation for Community Vitality, Courtney Scott, and Kestrel Ariel, with additional support from Blackfoot Communications, Heart of the Rockies Initiative, Northern Great Plains Joint Venture, Sarah Rubik, Rodney Fry, Beth Madden, Gary Whitted, Fernanda Robert, and Bill Long and Billy Miller. Thank you all so much for listening. We appreciate it if you're able to share this episode with others and subscribe to the Stories for Action podcast. Find out more about all of our work, including films and storytelling workshops, at storiesforaction.org. And check us out on Instagram and Facebook at Stories for Action. Thank you so much for being a part of our community, where our mission is to spark positive change for people and place through the power of storytelling.